with other victims of these crimes. So from there on, I've been in regular contact with Lars, and we've been trying to fight this cause to get some public awareness on these situations. And from there on, I know what's going on, and I know what to do, and I know what to think, and I finally understand what is going on a much wider scale.
Could you just go into a bit about the scanning and the findings we had on you?
Yeah, sure. Well, I was at the scanning in London, as I said, with Lars and loads of other people from around the world, mainly Europe, which was good to meet other people. And we did the scanning in Crawley. Well, I was more like a helper, wasn't I, Lars? I was helping you out a little bit.
Yes.
So there wasn't really much time for me and you to be scanned because we were so busy scanning everyone else. So we had to scan me in the apartment where we were staying. And I was really heavily being bombarded this week in London altogether with all the imaginary things these weapon systems can do. V2K, mind reading, influencing mind, and so forth. And I was quite ill some of these days because I was so heavily bombarded. So we decided to scan me in the night in our apartment after we'd done the scanning sessions. And we did scanning, and I came up positive for RF frequency emission. 6 different places on my body, and 5 of them in my head. And as I later discovered, speaking with Mr. Trower, all these places that are being microchipped in my brain or in my head are all the different areas of the brain which are key to controlling people. And so this was a frightening, scary thought that someone actually had implanted me covertly in my sleep, so many different places on my body, and all the different places on my head which are really used for daily life. So I'm definitely happy that I went to London. Mm-hmm. I just want to clarify that these severe rumours that have been made are untrue and are put in place to justify the sadistic and cruel experiments that are going on a daily basis. I have done everything humanly possible to clarify this. I am not a paedophile nor a snitch. And I would just like to say to my family, it's not too late to come forward and tell people the truth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for sharing the short version of your personal story with us. And later on in this program, we are going to have an interview with another Danish victim of domestic terrorism. And he's been chased around Europe. I would actually like to cover an area of history here that hasn't gotten much attention around the world. And that has to do with the MK program that was run by the CIA and other agencies in the 50s, 60s and 70s. It's a very little known fact that the MK program was not just limited to the United States and to Canada, but it actually extended all across Europe and even to the small country of Denmark. In Denmark alone, it has been revealed that there were more than 500 victims who were tortured to death, and it has been acknowledged by the Danish government. But it was a very, very hard struggle to get to that point, and all of the struggle and all of this little success was due to one man named Gunther Sandvej. He was a farmer who was enrolled in this program. He stood up and fought back, and he spent basically something like 25 years of his life fighting the CIA, fighting the Danish government, fighting the psychiatrists who were doing this to him. And in the end, he lost his farm, he lost everything, and he even lost his life. But he did manage to get the truth out, and did manage to bring the Danish government to acknowledge that this did happen, and that the survivors were compensated. It was a long road for him to get there, and he was tenaciously fought by the politicians initially, who were doing everything to try to prevent this from getting out. And in the United States there were two politicians who were very instrumental in trying to cover up the MKUltra program, during the Ford administration especially. And the two politicians that were trying to cover it up in the States were Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney. In Denmark, they had their counterparts in a neocon movement as well, and it was an aristocrat by the name of Britta Schall-Holberg, and she was fighting tenaciously to prevent any of the victims from ever getting any compensation while living on her rich mansion. And the people were basically tortured and dying in poverty, while the rich politicians of the neocon politicians were celebrating and having parties around there. And it wasn't until a couple of very courageous journalists teamed up with Gunnar Sandvej. Eventually, this led to a broadcast in the national TV, and that brought about an outcry in the population that was then basically enforced by the newspapers around the country. And ultimately, the politicians were forced to basically compensate the victims. Even at that stage, the neocons refused to vote for the special law that was put in place and gave the victims of those MKUltra programs the right for compensation. Stephen, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I think it's despicable, and it really just goes to show how long this has been going on so many different levels, and from we know the MKUltra from the United States, that it would go so far to Denmark. It's just unbelievable when you haven't had the knowledge or experience before you are a targeted person. We've become to realise this has been going on for a real long time, and it's still going on today, but in a much newer kind of way with different kinds of technologies.
I agree. And while we were doing a bit of research for this program to get the links and documentation that we are going to post in the chat board, we came across another disturbing thing, that this was not just going on in the United States, Canada and Denmark. It was also going on in Norway. But there was one major difference between Denmark and Norway. Norway also had 500 victims, but the majority of Norwegian victims were children. And to my knowledge, they have never been compensated.
Yeah, that's what I read as well. They were half German and half Norwegian kids from before the war and after the war,
yeah.
Which were done horrible things to, and normal people were making a mockery out of innocent kids that just had the unfortunate luck to be half German. Even the mothers, I read it as well, this article was calling them the German pigs and so forth.
Unfortunately, a lot of this mindset that they were victims of is still going on today, and it is deliberately used to miscredit victims of these types of experiments, to try to label them or ostracize them from society so they can't fight back. This is why the MKUltra program and its history is so important, because a lot of victims often face the question, why would they choose you? Why have you become a victim of this program? And the answer basically is given by the MKUltra program in the way that the victims were chosen because they were easily discredited. This was very apparent with the Danish case of MKUltra, and out of the 500 initial victims, only 154 were left for compensation. The majority had committed suicide and the rest had died in agony. The experiments were carried out in the two major hospitals in the Danish capital of Copenhagen by three leading psychiatrists by the name Ejner Gert Jørgensen, Fini Schulzinger, or Mogens Hertz. unfortunately, one of the leading doctors died before the case broke, and the two remaining doctors put all the blame on the dead person. This shows to their character and basically shows to the type of people involved in those kinds of atrocities.
And why they always say this question, why should they choose you? I don't think it's so much about why should we answer this question. We should turn this around and ask them, why us? Why is it necessary to experiment on people without their knowledge or without their consent?
A couple of days ago, I came across an article about Guantanamo and some of the rendition prisons around the world. It's all about a report that confirms that the inmates of Guantanamo have been given mind-altering drugs against their will, and they have been interrogated while under the influence of mind-altering drugs. The initial approval to use the inmates of Guantanamo as guinea pigs and test all kinds of drugs on them was given by Paul Wolfowitz, another member of the criminal cabal. Recently I went to England together with Stephen, and we were very fortunate to get an interview with a British scientist, Dr. Barry Trower, who was also a former British agent, and he actually in that interview touched on different forms of questioning, or interrogations in some cases you can call it, and we're going to hear a little snippet from that interview.
No, most of the questioning was thought up by psychiatrists and psychologists. In fact, the government today still uses psychologists and psychiatrists who would inject certain drugs, what you would call truth drugs. The psychiatrists would also mix the truth drugs with hypnosis. Okay. There's one thing I never understood. The psychiatrist always wanted the people naked. And I never understood, maybe it puts them in a defenceless situation, but I was always uncomfortable with why they had to be naked. I never really liked the thought of drugs, and I never liked the thought of hypnosis, which is why I prefer to work alone and just do it my way. So yes, I have witnessed what the government has written. The government has written that psychiatrists and psychologists were used, drugs were used, and I can reinforce the government's documents because I've witnessed it. And I can say, yes, it happened. I was there. I didn't like it, and it made me feel uneasy, but yes, it's happened, and I can witness it. One of the things that I can think of is that after the questioning was finished, they had no memory of being injected or hypnotized.
Okay.
They had no memory of it. The people I spoke to today, they could sit down and recount our conversations. They were very, very comfortable. With the psychiatrists and the psychologists, generally they had no knowledge after the event. Whereas with mine, if you sat them down here, they would all probably remember everything we talked about.
Okay. Would the work that the psychiatrist is and our medical people, would that be legal?
No, absolutely not. And that is written as well in documents. And somebody said I forgot the word they used, but dishonourable and shameful covers it. They used a word I can't remember at the moment, but it was unethical and dishonourable and shameful against everything that doctors should stand for. Yeah. Against everything they should stand for.
Yes. Because the psychiatrist, I imagine, hasn't taken his
Yeah, and they drove people to suicide. They really drove people